Welcome to Crypto Clarified, Investing in the Truth, a podcast series where we come together to discuss the most captivating headlines and trends in the crypto space. My name's Benjamin Dean. I'm Director in WisdomTree's Digital Assets team, and I'm joined by my co-host, the ever-brilliant Cami Russo, founder of Defiant Media. Cami, how's things?
Eventful, but as always, fascinating in crypto.
Yeah, it is always eventful. It's never quiet. I, on my end, have a mustache. For those of you who are joining us on YouTube, you can see that for yourself. But if you're listening on the podcast, just listen very carefully and you might hear it throughout the episode. Make sure you go to the defiant.io for all your DeFi needs. You can check out Cami at Cami Russo on Twitter. You can find me at Benjamin Dean. Look, we've got a great episode for you today. We're joined by our guest, Peter Van Valkenburgh, who's Director of Research at Coin Center in Washington, D.C. We'll be chatting to Peter about some what should now be relatively familiar acronyms to listeners, like OFAC. And we'll also be talking a little bit about other happenings in the crypto policy space, direct from DC. Then, of course, towards the end, we're going to touch on the elephant in the room, another acronym, FTX. We can't possibly do it justice, but we will touch on it towards the end. Before we start the episode, though, I have to do the usual shout out to James and Sam in compliance. I need to state the following and to clarify. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of WisdomTree, Defiant Media, and Coin Center, and are subject to change. Anything we present in this podcast is not intended to be relied upon as a forecast, research, nor as investment or tax advice. The information and opinions expressed in this podcast are not a recommendation, offer, or solicitation to buy or sell any securities, and reliance upon them is at the sole discretion of the listener. Please remember, past performance is no indication of future results. Now let's get on to the fun stuff. Peter, welcome. It's nice to see you again.
It's good to see you, Ben and Cami.
It turns out that the three of us go some way back, actually. I've known Peter for many years, particularly since I lived in Washington. Peter, you and Cami know each other from what I understand?
Yeah, we're all like dinosaurs in the crypto space at this point.
That's true.
I remember meeting Cami in New York City when we were first trying to figure out how Coin Center, a tiny nonprofit, focused on Bitcoin, because this was probably before Ethereum was even much of a conversation, would possibly reach out to reporters in New York City, and we like hosted a dinner and some other stuff. But that was all Niraj, so if it went well, he gets the credit, but if it went badly, he definitely gets the blame.
We're all OGs at this point. Shout out to Niraj as well. Now, Peter, let's get on to this a little bit. Coin Center, how about you give listeners a bit of a background on yourself, how you got involved in this space, and then a little bit about Coin Center, because I've been along for the journey with you folks for years, but it's not immediately obvious that how important the work that you folks do is in DC.
Yeah, Ben, you literally went on a journey for us, because you went sort of country by country and found out on the ground information about how they are thinking about crypto or Bitcoin and whether they're using it, which was, I think, a really good series we published. But anyway, so Coin Center has been around since 2014, which is why I say we're kind of like dinosaurs in the crypto space. And I've been here since the beginning. In fact, our entire team of 5 attorneys and policy experts have been here since the beginning. So I was graduating from law school from NYU, and I was sort of traveling in similar circles, especially on Twitter, with Jerry Brito, our executive director. He was teaching at George Mason and was at the Mercatus Center, focused on new technologies. He was writing about crypto there all the time. He was one of the first persons in DC to write an explanation of what Bitcoin is from a lawyerly standpoint. And basically, long story short, he was approached by some people who wanted to see more credible voices to explain the technology in Washington, DC, because at the time there were hardly any, and the Bitcoin Foundation was going through a lot of ugliness, which was sort of the one organization at the time. And so after some convincing, because he's not exactly the kind of person who just wants to quit his job and do something crazy, like start a new nonprofit. After some convincing, he decided to do it. A condition was that we'd be very independent. We had some generous donors. We continue to get very generous support from the community, but everybody knows that when you give to Coin Center, you don't get some sort of say in what we're going to represent to government. You don't get any say in who we're going to argue on behalf of, because we're mission driven. We're here to explain how Bitcoin and Ethereum and open blockchain networks like them are public goods, how they can improve, underlying technological and financial systems, but also what their risks are, and explain all of that to folks in positions of power and in public policy. So whether it's in Congress or at the federal agencies like Treasury or the SEC, if someone wants to call up Bitcoin, they can't, but they can call up Coin Center, and we're going to give them a neutral and I think educational and sort of plain English explanation of how things work. My role is director of research. So, formulating and building our educational materials for that purpose is part of my job. But an even bigger part of my job is figuring out the places where the technology's capabilities have outpaced the law or the way regulations apply, and there's a gap, and policymakers want to fill that gap with something. And so usually there's multiple possibilities. Like when the ICO boom happened in 2017, we'd already been on the ground in DC for 2 years, talking about how, look, Bitcoin's open source software, people are going to copy it, they're going to create what we then called altcoins, and some of those altcoins might be very centralized, and there might be promises from the issuer, which basically feed directly into the relevant test for what is a security. So we published a report saying, look, Bitcoin, decentralized cryptocurrencies don't fit the definition of security. They're not within the SEC's jurisdiction, in our opinion, but some things will be in the SEC's jurisdiction, and they should know about this to do their investor protection role, et cetera, et cetera. So that's that policy research, presenting policy alternatives, how to interpret existing laws to cover the technology is sort of where I live here at Coin Center. And it's the best job I could possibly ask for, aside from having a very close and awesome team of good people. It's also just a fantastically interesting area to work in because there's always new legal issues arising. And sometimes you get the chance to be the first person to say something about something. And that's fun, dangerous, but fun.
Maybe it's an acquired taste. Cami, have you ever had to go down to Washington and explain like Ethereum to folks down there?
No, not Washington, but I actually was called upon to talk to people at the SEC once to explain DeFi. It was kind of scary. I was like, I don't want to like say anything that will like do anything. Another kind of brush with like, I think like the most skeptical part of the spectrum was I was invited to speak at the Bank of International Settlement. So it was like a conference full of central bankers. It was a conference about DeFi in Zurich. But, for some reason, even though they were, holding this event on DeFi, everyone was like just extremely skeptical about it. So, I mean, those were two very interesting conversations, but no, not Washington yet. We'll see.
It's a tough job. Someone has to do it. Listeners, you should go and...
If you've been in front of the BIS, you could handle most rooms in Washington, I guess.
It was intense. Like, I don't know. I think, there's kind of this, I think, group of people that just don't understand the use, like the promise of crypto at its core. And I think that's where it, like, if you're starting from there, it's really hard to get anywhere. But I don't know. I'm hopeful that at least in the US, like regulators here, at least understand how crypto can be beneficial. So I think we're in a bit better position, hopefully. But
yeah, lots changed in the years. Like I used to joke with folks when I lived in Washington, going and explaining cybersecurity I was doing, and sometimes Bitcoin to people who don't know how to use email is a challenge. Things have changed a lot in recent years, though, and we have seen kind of a lot more recognition in Washington, a lot more activity. Coin Center, though, over the years has been consistent in working around privacy online, which is a hugely important topic when we're talking about Bitcoin or DeFi or any part of this space. That leads us kind of into the big topic that we should talk about today, and that is OFAC and Tornado Cash. Now, I don't know who wants to explain for our listeners, just a quick recap of what, maybe we'll go in sequence, what Tornado Cash is. Maybe Cami, you do that, and it's a link to Ethereum and why people use it. And then Peter, that maybe gives us a segue into why Coin Center's working on this.
Okay, sure. So I'll take a stab at Tornado Cash. So as probably our listeners know, public blockchains allow users to transact in a way that is pseudonymous. And I think there's a bit of a misconception, like headlines and like different kind of reports make it seem like transacting on blockchains is anonymous, and so like that attracts criminals and money laundering and so on. But actually, no, it's the opposite. It's the most transparent way of transacting that you could do, because even though you're not identified by kind of your legal name, your address and everything, it's done. All the transactions it's done in its history are stored there forever and potentially immutable unless there's like some sort of attack. So one would just have to link your address to your, legal name, and that's it. Somebody just has your entire financial history out there for the world to see. And so that's not a very, comfortable position to be in for anyone. I think you don't have to be a criminal to want your financial history to be kept to yourself. And for that reason, there are different services that allow users to transact privately on public blockchains, and Tornado Cash is one of them. And what it does is when you are sending crypto, you can send it through this service, which uses complicated cryptography to kind of obfuscate what the transaction is. So anyone kind of looking at your transaction doesn't know who you're sending funds to, how much you're transacting, and just allows you, to use the blockchain in a more private way. So, most of transactions that were happening in Tornado Cash were, legitimate transactions, just people wanting to use the blockchain privately. But it was being used. I think, there have been different reports that say about like maybe 20% of the use was for hackers wanting to kind of launder their illicit gains. So,
and that's Q OFAC stage left. At some point, this comes onto somebody's radar in one of the 3 and 4 letter agencies. Peter, what happens a few months ago? OFAC, who are they? What did they do? And then maybe that leads us into why they might be contentious for them to do it.
Yeah. So OFAC is the Office of Foreign Asset Control. It is a bureau within the U.S. Department of Treasury, and its objective is to form and enforce sanctions policy here and abroad. And U.S. sanctions policy has become one of our primary tools of conducting foreign policy, for better and for worse. And that's a whole nother topic that's probably worth several podcasts. Basically, what it is under a statute created by Congress, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, OFAC is allowed to identify foreign nationals, craft sort of emergency measures in certain situations. So usually it's a geographic region identified, but it could be a category of transactions. So it could be Iranian sanctions, it could be North Korean sanctions, it could be malicious cyber activities sanctions. These are all separate executive orders that have been crafted under using the IEEPA powers. And then the president creates the executive order, and OFAC goes and it identifies persons who are those, enemy persons, and adds them to the specially designated nationals list, the SDN list. So if your name is on the SDN list, what are the consequences? The consequences are that any American, and that means U.S. residents, U.S. persons, not just American citizens, is banned from transacting with you or with your property. So in 2018, to take a non-controversial example of sanctions power in the crypto world, OFAC added 2 Bitcoin addresses to the OFAC, to the SDN list. And these were the Bitcoin addresses of 2 Iranian nationals who were using these addresses to receive cryptocurrency, to receive Bitcoin that they were getting in cyber attacks, in ransomware attacks. And, the reason why I say this is non-controversial is this is a fairly routine exercise of sanctions power. You identify foreign persons who are subject to some sort of executive order, because they're Iranian or because they're engaged in cyber crimes or attacks. And then you add them to the list, and Americans therefore can't interact with them or their property. And those Bitcoin addresses that were added were, of course, the property of those Iranian nationals. If you sent Bitcoin to those addresses, they have the private keys to directly control that Bitcoin. You've directly enriched them or transacted with them in a very plain, straightforward way. Fast forward to August of this past year, OFAC takes another action in the cryptocurrency space where they add Tornado Cash to the SDN list. And the press release that announced it looked very similar to past press releases about OFAC adding persons involved in cryptocurrency crimes or transactions to the SDN list. And that's strange because as Cami just described, Tornado Cash is not a person. It's not an entity. It is this tool that lives on the Ethereum blockchain. So what do I mean by that? To sort of expand on Cami's description, when I, as an American, want to pay, say, Jerry Brito, my boss, on Ethereum, if I want privacy in that transaction, I can send some ETH to the Tornado Cash smart contract, one of 20 smart contract addresses that are part of the Tornado Cash tool on the Ethereum blockchain. And that contract address has some software in it. And what that software does is it locks the ETH I've sent to it and gives me a withdrawal receipt, if you will. And now I keep that offline, and I go from another Ethereum address, or I give that receipt to Jerry even, and Jerry goes from another Ethereum address that's never previously been associated with the sending addresses on the Ethereum blockchain. So there's no link between them. And that address can then send a message to the Tornado Cash smart contract that says, here's this withdrawal note, and it's a zero knowledge proof, which is how the contract knows that the person asking for the money back actually put money in, so that nobody's taking anyone else's funds. But it doesn't reveal which address that person is coming from. So there's no public information about which address put the money in. It's just that address is now, the withdrawal address is now able to remove the funds because of the zero knowledge note. And so maybe I do that before giving the money to Jerry so that my transaction to Jerry is private, or maybe Jerry does that. In either case, the only people or entities that are involved in this transaction are me, a law-abiding American citizen doing nothing wrong, and Jerry, a law-abiding American citizen doing nothing wrong. The smart contract is not a person or entity. It's just software on the Ethereum blockchain. And so this is why we believe that this is sort of an overstep of OFAC's sanctioning powers, because they're not identifying something like an Iranian foreign national or a North Korean foreign national or some other enemy person or entity. They're identifying code on the Ethereum blockchain, which no one has control over, which no one can edit or change as a person, and adding that to the SDN list. And, this is problematic for a number of reasons. The biggest one to me is even OFAC in that press release and in other public statements says the purpose of sanctions law is not to punish. We're not here to punish people. The purpose of sanctions law is to push for behavioral changes. We add Iranians to the sanctions list in the hope that Iran will change its government in the long run. That's the, sort of very interesting to state it that cleanly, I think, but that's the goal. Is we hope that it will lead to a regime change, to the rise of democracy, or an end to support of terrorism, things like this. And so if the purpose of sanctions law is behavioral change, then adding a inert, immutable smart contract, a software tool to the OFAC list, to the SDN list, doesn't jibe with that purpose, because you're not going to change software. It's just going to always be there. The behavior of people you're going to change is Americans in this case. You're going to make it impossible for me to pay my friend in a completely legitimate transaction. And that's the behavior you're actually affecting. And that goes well beyond the intent of the OFAC underlying statutory authority, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, whose, Congress created this law and sent OFAC this power because they wanted to have a regime that would encourage behavioral changes from non-Americans. They didn't intend it to be a tool that OFAC could use arbitrarily to tell Americans which software tools they can and cannot use, and whether they can have privacy when engaged in otherwise fully legal transactions with other U.S. persons or with non-criminal international persons.
So let's summarize then for the listeners, just so they're fully up to speed, because the punchline is Coin Center's suing OFAC.
Oh, yeah. I probably should have led with that. I buried it a bit.
That's okay. We'll focus in on that. But the grounds on which you're doing it is interesting, and you've mentioned it. But let's go through for the listeners. You've got a set of smart contracts software that can be used to obfuscate the way in which transactions occur so that the recipient doesn't necessarily know the sender, and you can't work backwards on the blockchain to then, as Cami says, identify people after the fact based on their addresses. So it's a way in which to preserve privacy. It is software. It exists on the Ethereum network. And Cami, if we think this out a little bit then, what else is like smart contracts on the Ethereum network where people can exchange things with one another? It sounds a lot like DeFi. So is there some like risk here where you apply rules to one set of circumstances that then open the door to a whole bunch of other consequences that haven't been thought through fully?
Yeah, that's the question. I mean, if the U.S. can sanction Tornado Cash, they could sanction any other DeFi protocol, arguably. I mean, is that the case? Like, could they just come and say, hey, MakerDAO is being used by criminals. Let's, put it, like those smart contracts on the OFAC list.
Say, well, Peter, does that open the door to other DeFi protocols potentially being sanctioned down the line?
Yeah, I don't see the limiting principle in OFAC's current interpretation of their statute. This is, again, why we are suing OFAC, trying to get an injunction to reverse and stop this particular sanction listing. I don't see a limiting principle because I don't believe their interpretation is actually a reasonable interpretation of the underlying law. But if, we were to presume that it's a reasonable interpretation of underlying law, or if we were to lose our court case and a court was to find that it's a reasonable interpretation of the underlying law, then there would be no limiting principle here. There's something unique about DeFi on Ethereum and privacy preserving decentralized applications like Tornado Cash on Ethereum, in that you could see everything going into the black box, but you can't track it, right? And that makes it, I think, a very attractive target for these kinds of perhaps overbroad enforcement actions, because it's hard to resist. Because the fact of the matter is there will be some criminals using Tornado Cash. There just will. As Cami said, estimates vary somewhere between 5 and 20% of the amount of usage of Tornado Cash might have been illicit. And it is true that North Korea, to the extent that we believe that the Lazarus Group is North Korean, which we do, and the Lazarus Group used ransomware, it is true that the Lazarus Group moved money through Tornado Cash. So, it's true that these tools can be used by criminals. And when you see it on Ethereum, when you see transactions going to this address, I think if you're maybe not fully aware of how Ethereum works, or you're not fully aware of the decentralized nature or the immutable nature of these smart contracts, you'd say, okay, well, we can track the money. The money went from the North Korean hacker to this person. And they point to the Tornado Cash address. And, well, that's the person we add to the OFAC list. But again, as I just explained, that's not a person. That's a smart contract. No one has any control over that software. You really can only sort of identify the people using the tool. You can't identify the tool as something on the list itself. And if you let OFAC continue to identify tools rather than persons and add them to the SDN list, you basically give them this really unchecked power, because there's no process, there's no public process to designation. There's no hearing before a judge where the parties can come say, I don't deserve to be on the list. It all happens in private, and then one day you wake up and your name's on the list. So there's this opaque process that OFAC would be able to use to simply say, this technology, no longer available for U.S. persons to use. We've added it to the list. And yes, that could be a smart contract, another smart contract like Tornado Cash, like maybe the Maker DAO smart contract, or any other Ethereum-based DeFi contract. It could even be entire protocols, because I don't see the limiting principle here. If the limiting principle is not you're only allowed to add persons to the list, then what is the limiting principle? Why couldn't you put the entirety of the Bitcoin protocol on the list? Why couldn't you put Zcash, which is a layer one cryptocurrency that actually uses the exact same technology as Tornado Cash to have peer-to-peer private transactions? Why wouldn't you just put that whole protocol on the list? So it's a dangerous precedent, and that's one of the major reasons why Coin Center is challenging it. We believe that people should be able to use Tornado Cash on Ethereum, and if we win, they'll be able to use it legally again in the US. But we also believe that if we don't win now, it's really bad, because all of these cryptocurrency networks, all of the applications running on them could simply be identified as the person that Americans are no longer allowed to transact with. And that is both, I think, unconstitutional outside of OFAC statutory authority, and obviously incredibly bad for innovation, unless you think that there's nothing but crime happening on these technological platforms, which maybe some people do, but I think that's a gross misrepresentation.
In lead up to the show, Cami made a very good point, and I was just getting my Phil Zimmerman vibes from what you were just saying. Cami, what is code in the United States?
Oh, yeah. So I think that was just like a really interesting point of discussion at the time this happened, which is, isn't software just speech? And the U.S. has, very, very strong free speech protections. So, could that be an avenue to argue that the OFAC overstepped, that it was going against free speech because it's sanctioning software in the end?
So we make a free speech claim in our lawsuit, but I need to be very clear about sort of the limits of the power of that argument in this context. So let me back up a bit. Code is definitely speech. Publishing code is not the kind of activity that, under the First Amendment protections we enjoy in the US, the government is allowed to subject to some sort of licensing or permission-based requirement, let alone a full ban on publishing code. Ben, you mentioned Phil Zimmerman, PGP creator, cryptographer. Back in the 90s, strong encryption cryptography, so for keeping secrets, was classified as a munition, and to some extent it still is actually, which means that if you're an American person, you're not allowed to import or export those technologies without a license. And Phil Zimmerman challenged that. Other cryptographers challenged that. We ended up with cases that made it up to the circuit level. None of them made it up to the Supreme Court level. Probably the number one to identify is Department of Justice versus Bernstein. And in that case, the cryptographer is publishing, I think it was RSA encryption protocols. And he was publishing them in a book so that, you'd have a lot of trouble arguing that this isn't just speech publication. And the court rightly said, yeah, this can't be subject to these export control rules because we're putting prior restraint on Americans' ability to publish speech. And that's not something we allow under the Constitution, because we believe in the free exchange of ideas, and we believe that's what makes for open societies, liberal democracies, innovation, etc. So fast forward, so that's the basis. Fast forward now to Tornado Cash. OFAC is very clear in the frequently asked questions that they offered in the wake of their Tornado Cash sanction, that it is still okay for American persons to publish the code, to download or look at the code on the website, like the GitHub repository where the software resides, or the Ethereum blockchain itself, to share it, copy it, teach about it. Matt Green, cryptographer and professor at Johns Hopkins, actually sort of petitioned saying, look, I teach a class on Tornado Cash and privacy tools on these blockchains. Am I allowed to continue teaching that class? And OFAC said, yes, you're allowed to continue teaching that class. So OFAC is, their lawyers are very smart, and their lawyers know that if they actually took a strong stance there would immediately be First Amendment pushback, and they'd probably lose based on those past cases like Bernstein versus Department of Justice. OFAC is saying something slightly different with the sanction. They're saying, yes, you can publish speech all you want. Americans just aren't allowed to use certain software, even if that software is speech. And they're on interesting ground here, because publishing software is a little different than using software. And that's undeniable. To some extent, it's more like conduct than speech. It's more like burning a flag than writing a treatise about, liberty or against the American system, for that matter. And conduct, even if it's expressive, like flag burning, can be subject to permission-like regulation or even full bans. And this is sensible because we wouldn't want it to be a constitutionally protected right for someone to burn 5,000 flags doused in gasoline in the lobby of a building, because that may be expressive, very expressive, but extraordinarily dangerous. So of course we can make that something that's a crime or forbidden. So conduct, while it gets some protections, gets lesser protections under First Amendment grounds. And that's part of the reason why, if OFAC's going to come and say, we're not banning speech, we're banning usage of the code to do things in the world, which is conduct, when we come and we bring our lawsuit, we're making primarily statutory authority arguments. We're not saying code is speech, you can't do anything on the Ethereum blockchain as far as banning people from using it, because I'm not sure that would be a wise tactic from a lawsuit standpoint, from a litigation standpoint. Instead, we're saying, no, Congress sent you specific powers in the International Emergency Economic Powers Act that allow you to identify persons or majority foreign-owned entities, add them to the SDN list, and then ban Americans from transacting with those persons or their property. And Tornado Cash, the 20 immutable smart contracts that people actually use to get privacy, are not a person, not a majority foreign-owned entity, and they're not the property of any person or majority foreign-owned entity. They're software on the Ethereum blockchain. And so that is not something that Congress gave you the power to do. You can't just identify software tools and put them on the OFAC list. We are, however, making an additional First Amendment claim that's a little different. It's actually an associational privacy claim. So the First Amendment is both free speech and also freedom of assembly, your right to sort of get together and petition the government and protest and all these sorts of things. And the interesting fact is, you don't only have a right in the US to assemble and protest, you have a right to do it anonymously and privately. Because in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, several pro-segregation Jim Crow states in the South attempted to get lists of all the people who were doing the sit-in protests or the bus riding protests. They tried to get lists of the NAACP's full membership who was contributing to those organizations to organize civil disobedience and protests. And obviously they weren't trying to help these people. They were trying to target them, to intimidate them, to get them to stop standing up for what they thought was right. And so the NAACP challenged one of these requests for membership from law enforcement And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The case is Alabama versus NAACP. And the Supreme Court said, no, the government can't demand to know who is participating in, expressive association in civil disobedience organizations or nonprofits with genuine causes. Because if they did, no one would participate in those things anymore, if they were even vaguely controversial. And so that right to have anonymous association is part of our First Amendment freedoms. And so our secondary claim, after the statutory authority argument I've already laid out in our lawsuit, is by making it a crime for Americans to use Tornado Cash to protect their privacy when donating, for example, to Coin Center, a nonprofit, and expressing their political associations and interests through that donation. Or for that matter, when making it a crime for Americans to use Tornado Cash to privately donate to support the defense of Ukraine, which is, we have co-plaintiffs in our lawsuit, other people who are joining us. One of our co-plaintiffs is someone who's supported substantial donations to support the defense of Ukraine via the Ethereum blockchain. And the reason why they needed to use Tornado Cash to facilitate those donations is because they in a very real way, fear reprisals from Russian intelligence at the Ethereum addresses where they would otherwise be public and doing things on the Ethereum blockchain, if the Russian intelligence agencies were able to associate those donations with their public Ethereum activities. So these are constitutionally protected activities: donating to a nonprofit that agitates for civil liberties like Coin Center, donating to a nonprofit that is working to defend a country that's being invaded by a totalitarian state. These are the kinds of activities you're allowed to engage in, and the government can't say that they need to know your identity when you engage in these activities. That's unconstitutional. So that's our secondary claim that is a First Amendment claim, but it's not the code of speech claim that I think some people think it might be. And that's important because the code of speech claim extended to something like you can't you can't enforce sanctions here is not a winning argument, I think.
So it looks like it wouldn't have been a good avenue for the U.S. Treasury or OFAC to say we're not going after these smart contracts, but we're going after the software developers who created Tornado Cash, because that would have been a losing argument, because then you could easily argue they didn't do anything wrong. They just published code. So what would have been if they definitely wanted to take some sort of action against the Lazarus Group using Tornado Cash? I have like no legal grounds to say this, but just like logically, it seems like, why not just sanction the Lazarus Group's address? I mean, is that as simple as that, or does it work that way?
So they already are. The Lazarus Group and I think associated Ethereum addresses have been subject to sanctions, and in many ways, the malicious cyber actor executive order, which is the basis for the Tornado Cash sanction and several other sanctions, is directly targeted at primarily Russian and North Korean hacking activities. So I think this is, and we're not contesting that. You're right, Cami. That's exactly the right approach. Is I want to use Ethereum. I do not want ever to even accidentally pay North Korea. And so if there's a machine readable list, and the SDN list is available in JSON, it's available in RSS, it's available in any format you want, that would help me as a US person who's a patriot and actually does believe in our American system, especially our Constitution, never pay, a North Korean, I'm happy to use that list and always, refuse to transact with those people. But Tornado Cash isn't one of those people. It is a tool. And the vast majority of people who use the tool are using it for the right reasons. So, things get complicated in the DeFi space and the cryptocurrency space. A simpler way to think of this is like, look, no one would object, I think, to an enemy state being something that Americans aren't allowed to deal with, if we're really in a state of war or something warlike. But if the government was to come and say, well, we know this enemy state's getting a lot of benefit from broadcasting propaganda over the radio, which of course all enemy states do, therefore Americans can't use radio anymore, it would be the height of absurdity. And it would also be counter to the very point of sanctions, because the reason why we sanction North Korea is because they are illiberal, is because they do not give their citizens freedom to protest, to stand up for what's right, to engage in economic transactions that they think would benefit themselves and their neighbors. And so, the way we win is by being better than them, and by saying, like, look, yes, you should be able to donate to Coin Center using Tornado Cash, because that's part of what makes America great. That's part of what makes America a free country, where people can associate privately and support the causes they want to support, and not live in fear of government reprisals for something that's unpopular but otherwise illegal.
So how much longer then until you'll get to a result? Is this something that's going to drag out for some time, or?
Yeah, so I'm not a litigation expert. This is an interesting turning point in Coin Center's history, actually. For the last 8 years, we've mostly done the education and outreach to agencies work that I described at the beginning. It's only in the last 2 years that we've stepped into the realm of impact litigation, of actually suing the government or an agency because of what we think is, unconstitutional or outside of statutory authority activities. So, I suspect the way these things tend to work is, we file our complaint. We filed in a district court in Florida because one of our co-plaintiffs is there, and they get paid on the Ethereum blockchain, their salary, and they just want privacy with regards to their salary, which is perfectly reasonable, very American, I think. And what happens next is the government gets a chance to file a response. They usually get like 60 days, which is a little longer than private parties get, because we give deference to government agencies in these cases. And then, what will they file? Probably a motion to dismiss, but we'll have to see. I don't know yet. And then the judge will have to hear responses to that motion. And then eventually, if we don't get dismissed, which I don't think we will, and I believe we're going to win in the long run, we go through these iterations, 60 days, 60 days, 60 days. So we're probably talking a year to 2 years before we get some sort of clear result. And then it can always be appealed. So, this is cold comfort for people who actually, can no longer use Ethereum in a private way. And we're actually, relying on that. But again, ideally we'll win, and then they'll be able to use Tornado Cash legally again in the US. But more importantly, this will draw a line where a line very badly needs to be drawn, because otherwise I don't see anything stopping OFAC from just adding any technology, the entire Bitcoin protocol, the Zcash protocol, heck, even the Signal encrypted messaging protocol to the OFAC list. It doesn't even have to be a cryptocurrency if you're allowed to identify tools as things Americans can't use anymore with that statutory power.
Yeah, absolutely.
What happens to the addresses that transacted with Tornado Cash before, or even that are still transacting with Tornado Cash now? Like, are they also under, like, are they also being sanctioned?
So there is a thing called secondary sanctions, which OFAC has actually mentioned in the context of Tornado Cash, wherein a sanctioned address transact with another address or another person, and therefore that other person gets added to the SDN list. Generally speaking, that hasn't happened so far. At least we haven't seen non-Tornado Cash addresses who receive Tornado Cash payments or things like that added to the SDN list. But one of our co-plaintiffs, he runs a podcast actually, and because he's a public figure, he's widely known in the Ethereum community, and because he had a public Ethereum, an ENS domain, when the Tornado Cash sanction happened, some hacker who we still don't know, or person, decided to use Tornado Cash to dust a bunch of public figures' Ethereum addresses, among them our co-plaintiff, also including Jimmy Fallon and Shaquille O'Neal and a few others.
What does dust mean there for the listeners, Peter? What does it mean to dust someone's account?
Yeah, they called it a dusting attack because basically this person, whoever they were, took a decent amount of Ethereum, put it through Tornado Cash, and then sent small amounts, like dust, to all of these public figures. And the reason they did this, I mean, if we can speculate about their motivations, is because every one of those public figures is now obligated. They're not sanctioned, but they've received money from a sanctioned address. So they're all obligated now to, as long as the sanction is in place, do annual reporting about that blocked property. And they were obligated to alert OFAC to that transaction within, I think, 10 days of receipt of that transaction. And so this is a heavy duty sort of national security reporting obligation that's simply been put onto people, all kinds of people like Jimmy Fallon and Shaquille O'Neal, even though they did nothing wrong through no fault of their own. They had an Ethereum address that was public, and somebody sent stuff to that address through Tornado Cash. And I think this aspect of the sanction and having one of these people as our co-plaintiffs really sort of underlines the absurdity of the situation. That address is not going to go away. Unlike when sometimes OFAC sanctions a foreign financial institution and says, look, you guys are facilitating transactions with Iran. That's why you, as a foreign financial institution, are now sanctioned. What would normally happen in that case, from my understanding, having spoken with folks who've been at OFAC in the past, is there'd be teams, on a plane to that bank in Panama to figure out how they can limit the damage of sanctioning this, institution that is both doing legitimate transactions and illegitimate transactions. How can they segregate the legitimate funds from the illegitimate funds? How can they make sure that people who got to pay their mortgage are still able to pay their mortgage, even though the bank's frozen? And there'd be sensitivity to this, and there'd be a way to, again, push for behavioral change. In the Tornado Cash context, there's no opportunity to do that because there's no person running this bank. It's just a software tool. And so now everybody who was using that software tool, and may even have money stuck in it, is sort of shit out of luck, with no due process and no compensation from government, despite that taking, even if they did nothing wrong. And the tool's going to continue doing stuff because that's the way Ethereum works. It's the way these technologies work. And somebody could dust me tomorrow. Someone could dust you, Ben. I hope you don't get dusted, because then you might have trouble
give them ideas.
with U.S. banks and things like that. But, this could continue to happen. And it's just silly. It's just a waste of law enforcement and national security resources to try and do sanctions policy this way, because you're going to create all of these unintended consequences and collateral damage. And you're not actually going to be stopping the North Koreans from continuing to use the smart contract on their own. I see no point to this whole exercise except pain.
Yeah, it's another example of where you take old laws, rules, regulations, and then layer them onto new technology, and what you expect is going to happen. Sometimes it's unpredictable, but in this case, it's very predictable. It's not the only instance of it, though. You folks at Coin Center are working on a few different things. I know we're coming up on time. They're all in the same vein, though. If you just run through quickly some of the other instances where you're working on this broad topic, really, which is where rules just don't make sense given the realities of the technology.
Yeah, so briefly, this is not our first lawsuit. It's our second lawsuit. Last year, Congress passed the infrastructure bill, and within many provisions, there was this sort of almost hidden provision that would require what we call cash and coin reporting obligations in cryptocurrency transactions. And what that means is, even if you're not using an intermediary like Coinbase or some sort of centralized custodian, if somebody pays you at your wallet from their wallet more than $10,000 worth of cryptocurrency in just a normal peer-to-peer transaction, maybe because I'm selling a valuable antique to you, I will need to collect your name, social security number, and physical address, write it on a paper form. There's no way to electronically file, called the Form 8300. And under 6050I, which is the relevant statute, I'm obligated to then send that form to FinCEN and the IRS. So this is a statute that requires ordinary persons just engaged in private transactions to surveil other Americans. And so we believe that's unconstitutional under the Fourth Amendment. And also, just as you were saying, Ben, it doesn't fit, it doesn't work. It's not a rational way to apply existing law to new technology, because if I'm a Bitcoin miner and I receive a Bitcoin block reward, that's a receipt in trade or business, which is the relevant statutory trigger. And I need to identify the name, physical address, and social security number of the Bitcoin protocol that just paid me this amount of cryptocurrency. And there is no name. If I was to pay a DeFi protocol, whose name do I put on this? So there's no sensitivity to the technology in the way this law was sort of just carbon copied onto crypto transactions. And I also think it's unconstitutional from a Fourth Amendment standpoint. And then the last thing I'll mention is we're still also waiting for some sort of result in the what has been referred to as the unhosted wallet rulemaking, which was 2 Christmases ago, was my entire holiday, actually, when the end of the Trump administration, Secretary Mnuchin tried to create a rule that said that regulated exchanges like Coinbase don't only need to know their customers, they need to know the people their customers are paying. And this, we offered several comments. It slowed down the regulatory process, which is why we still don't have a final rule here, but this is on the horizon. Our comments basically say what you would expect. It's that you can't obligate a corporation like Coinbase to surveil someone who's not their customer. You can't obligate them. So if I have a Coinbase account and I'm paying you, Ben, or telling Coinbase to pay you, Ben, but you're not Coinbase's customer, Coinbase has no legitimate reason to collect private information about you simply because I asked them to pay you. And so that's another area where maybe one day we'd have a lawsuit, but we're still waiting for a final rule on that rulemaking.
Cami, I hope you're not planning on buying or selling any antiques using USDC anytime soon, because you'll have to report it if you do.
God.
That sounds like a
no.
good
This is all crazy. It just makes no sense. I don't know. I'm an optimist, and I assume people writing these rules will see that this is just simply new technology that doesn't fit the old ways of doing things, and that the rules just need to be either updated or interpreted in a different way. So I think we're just like so early in crypto. It's why we're having to deal with all these regulations that don't make any logical sense to the space.
Maybe next time the SEC invites you, you go with Peter and go.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think it needs to be all of us in crypto advocating for just like a clear and just like a clear playing field that doesn't limit innovation and growth in this space.
Yep, indeed. So we are coming slightly up on time. Peter, are you going to be working over Christmas? I mean, you've got a new Congress. I noticed there's a majority in both houses now. Are there any things on your radar that are going to interrupt Christmas dinner? I guess it's Thanksgiving more in the United States, so maybe you'll get a holiday after all.
I mean, so as you mentioned, you were hoping we'd get briefly to just a little bit about FTX. Not knowing, with any certainty, any of the factual details of what's gone wrong, I can't really comment on anything specific. But the general news that FTX was heavily involved in lobbying DC is true. And the conclusion that a lot of people are drawing from that we've severely damaged our relationships with policymakers because of that is probably at least somewhat founded. There's still great champions in Congress and in the agencies who believe in the technology, understand the technology, and want to regulate it in a sensible way. And so we'll continue working with those folks. But for folks who already wanted to see this technology made illegal or destroyed or get its comeuppance, this is an obvious excuse to sort of just go push for the hardest, most aggressive anti-innovation, anti-crypto policies that they can come up with.
What does the view look like from where you're sitting, Cami? You've no doubt had a week, just like all of us, really, having to go over this.
Yeah.
What are some quick thoughts about early on, given we don't really know a lot so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it's just complete outrage at least what's been made public about what SBF, FTX, and Alameda were doing. Essentially, taking user funds apparently from FTX, lending them out to Alameda, and having this hedge fund just use user funds to fund their risky investments. And these are at least like million plus users who were affected. There's $8 billion missing. So it's just such a huge blow to crypto. So that's just the first thing, and then the second thing on DeFi versus CeFi. I think this year has been such. It's been made clear over and over again why decentralized finance, open finance, non-custodial wallets, transacting directly with smart contracts is just so much better than centralized finance and traditional finance. Most of the blow-ups that happened were in CeFi, this centralized exchange with FTX. The reason why we didn't see these transactions happening is because they were opaque. We didn't have the open blockchain to verify what was going on. Same thing with Celsius, and it's same thing with Three Arrows Capital. Like all of these massive just scandals and collapses in crypto, they've been in kind of the more centralized end. I think Luna and Terra were the only ones that happened in actual kind of DeFi. It was bad token design, that this algorithmic stablecoin that unraveled. But at least users of Luna Terra had the opportunity of looking at the code and judging for themselves how risky investing in this token and in these protocols were. Users of FTX didn't have the same opportunity to really assess the risk because it was completely opaque. So I think this is just confirming to me that DeFi is just a better financial system. But I think it's also a very kind of it's the easy argument to make, but it's not completely. It has its caveats. I don't think DeFi is really ready for mainstream. It's not like DeFi can one day just take on the millions of users that are trusting CeFi right now. There's tons of roadblocks for that, from scalability to UX to even kind of these regulatory gray areas that we're talking about. So yeah, DeFi is better, but I think there's still kind of a long way to go before it can actually replace CeFi. So CeFi just needs to be more transparent and needs to offer some more guarantees that it hasn't been offering so far.
I have the feeling we're all going to end up spending a lot more time trying to explain the differences between DeFi protocols and applications, self-hosted wallets, transparency that comes with open source code, versus what here is, commingling of funds between an exchange and a hedge fund, taking on over-leveraged long positions on volatile assets. These are the kinds of things that we've seen in just traditional finance for decades. Failures, actually. I can't understand personally how these folks thought that the rules don't apply to them. Fraud is fraud. And fraud has been committed, then those same exact rules will apply regardless of what someone's been, where they've domiciled. So it's going to be a lot more work now to have to explain this to folks, particularly as we watch this contagion flow through what was really a very opaque lending set of arrangements that that didn't used to exist, right? Back in 2014, you know, Peter, you're at Coin Center. Cami, you're writing a book on Ethereum. It's like lending didn't exist. It's a relatively new phenomenon, and we're starting to see actually just like how poorly run it was, but not because the software failed or the protocol failed or someone lost the private keys. It's straight up old school financial failure.
Yeah, and I very much worry that in the wake of the collapse, people will sort of write off the protocols and the original technology, when in reality, as you just said, what's failed here is a very old system. It's just lending. It's just leverage and banking and centralized institutions taking money from their customers to gamble. And that's a regulated activity. It's often just an illegal activity, and it's fraud. And so, it's interesting, like, to go back to what you're saying, like, am I going to have to work over Thanksgiving? Am I going to have to work over Christmas? We don't even need new laws to address these kinds of like fundamental abuses. We don't. And yet I do think that, again, folks who already had an uncharitable view of crypto and don't want to see it grow in the world might use this catastrophe to sort of label the entire technological endeavor as unsound, when in reality, DeFi and self-custody are the answers to these problems that we've had for centuries, as far as over-leveraged financial systems and opaqueness.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, unfortunately, we're at time. I know we can always keep going for hours and hours and hours, but I hope the listeners found today's podcast useful and informative. Go to the defiant.io for all your DeFi info needs. If you want to check up on what's going on with FTX, hit up the defiant.io. Cami's at Cami Russo on Twitter. I'm at Benjamin Dean. Peter, where can folks find you in Coin Center on the interwebs?
So I'm at Valkenburgh on Twitter, and we're also at Coin Center on Twitter, and we're coincenter.org. And again, put in a brief plug, we are relying on our donors for support. So if you like the work we're doing, please consider supporting us. And maybe do it anonymously, although unfortunately you can't do it through Tornado Cash if you're a U.S. person. Unless you want to become a co-plaintiff in a lawsuit.
Well, if you want to be a co-plaintiff in a lawsuit, you've now got your instructions from Peter. Peter, Cami, it's always nice to see you. Have a very happy Thanksgiving if you celebrate it. Thank you again to everyone who's listened. And we all hope you have an excellent day. Ciao.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Cami.